Did one federal appeals court just hand the United States Supreme Court a constitutional roadmap for America's biggest Second Amendment case in decades coming up in the next term? I think that's the question every gun owner should be asking today, ladies and gentlemen, because yesterday the Third Circuit Court of Appeals didn't just rule against New Jersey, it did something much, much bigger. It declared New Jersey's ban on an entire class of semi-automatic rifles unconstitutional. It struck down New Jersey's 10-round magazine limit, and then acknowledged that the United States Supreme Court has already agreed to hear two of the biggest gun ban cases in modern history next term. The timing of this is extraordinary. Today, I'm going to explain what this court actually said, why it matters, how it relies on Heller and Bruen, and why millions, whether they own an AR-15 or not, should be paying very close attention. Because this isn't just about New Jersey, it never has been. This is about the future of the Second Amendment. So, let's break it down. Let me divide it into parts. Part one, this wasn't just another gun case. Let's get that out of the way. If you've only seen the headlines, you probably would think the Third Circuit may have ruled on just one rifle. That's the way they make it look. But that's not what happened. The district court had ruled only as to the Colt AR-15. That was the district court, the lower court. The Third Circuit said the record supported a broader result and modified the judgment to apply to the full class of semi-automatic rifles while sending other firearm categories back for further proceedings. So think about that for just a second. That is a fundamentally different opinion. This court wasn't looking at just one manufacturer. It wasn't looking at one model. It was looking at an entire category of firearms, ladies and gentlemen. That's exactly why this opinion matters nationally. Let's give it a part two here, because the court kept coming back to Bruen over and over. If you followed my channel or listened to my radio program, you've heard me talk about Bruen for years. Here's why. Before Bruen, many courts balanced constitutional rights against government interests. Bruen rejected that approach. The Third Circuit explained that courts now ask two questions. First, does the Second Amendment text cover the conduct? If yes, the burden shifts to the government to show that the challenged regulation is in fact consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation, not simply that it advances an important policy goal. That's a completely different constitutional framework than we've worked with forever. And the Third Circuit applies that framework throughout this entire opinion. So that would lead me to a third part as we break this down. And there's two words that may decide everything here, folks. We get to the heart of the opinion. Two words: common use. The Third Circuit spends substantial time discussing what that phrase means under Heller and Bruen. It explains that weapons commonly possessed today for lawful purposes cannot simultaneously be treated as dangerous and unusual in the historical sense. Why does that matter? Because Heller protects arms in common use for lawful purposes. The opinion also explains that lawful purposes are not limited to self-defense alone, noting that historically Americans have lawfully possessed firearms for purposes such as hunting as well. The court's opinion and point is straightforward. If millions of Americans lawfully possess a class of firearms, that widespread lawful ownership is an important part of the constitutional analysis here. That discussion is one reason this opinion has drawn so much attention. Fourth part, if we're breaking it down into parts, the magazine ruling is probably just as important, right? Another major part of this opinion, but it's received less attention, is the magazine restriction. It doesn't get less attention here. The district court upheld New Jersey's 10-round magazine law. The Third Circuit reversed that portion of the judgment and held that the magazine restriction also violated the Second Amendment, declining to reach the separate takings clause issue because of that constitutional ruling. That's a major development. And it's one more reason this decision is likely to be closely studied as litigation continues around the country, especially with what's happening at Supreme Court next term. Fifth part would say, I would now have to say, connect this to the Supreme Court. So let's do that because they did. Here's why the opinion reaches beyond New Jersey. The Third Circuit itself recognized that the Supreme Court has already granted review in Viramontes and Grant, both cases, Second Amendment Foundation cases, the two major hardware ban cases that are scheduled for the upcoming term. Those cases present different records and issues, and the Supreme Court will make its own independent decision. But they involve many of the same constitutional principles discussed throughout this opinion. How courts should apply Heller, Bruen, and the history and tradition framework to restrictions on commonly owned firearms. That is why legal observers across the country are paying such close attention here. We're entering what could become one of the most significant periods for Second Amendment jurisprudence in decades. The Third Circuit has now issued an extensive opinion explaining just how it believes the Constitution applies to Jersey's assault firearm and magazine restrictions. The Supreme Court will soon consider major hardware ban cases of its own. Whether you're a gun owner, a constitutional law enthusiast, or simply interested in how Supreme Court precedent develops, folks, the next term is going to matter. I'll be following every filing, every brief, every oral argument, and every opinion right out of the box right here on Armed American Radio. So if you appreciate constitutional analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the norm, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and let me know in the comments down below the video. Check out our channel. We appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video, and thanks for watching.